first speaker is Natasha Minsker, who is the campaign manager for the Yes on 34 campaign and the initiative campaign to replace California's death penalty. Ms. Minsker has been the death penalty policy director of the ACLU of Northern California for 7 years. Previously, Ms. Minsker spent 5 years at the Alameda County Public Defender's Office. She has also worked in the state and federal court systems. Wait for a minute, but I want to point out Natasha right there she is. Give her a hand if you want. Yes. And James Clark is the Southern California Regional Coordinator of the Yes on 34 campaign to replace the death penalty. Since 2010, he has served as death penalty repeal organizer for the ACLU of Southern California, and he regularly contributes to the Huffington Post, Change.org, California Progressive Report, LA Progressive, and others. James previously worked as the coordinator of Georgians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, a nonprofit organization working to end capital punishment in Georgia, where he was a leader in the movement to stop the execution of Troy Davis. James. Elspeth Farmer is the current chair of the Criminal Justice Plank of the Platform Committee of the California Democratic Party. She practiced criminal defense as an assistant public defender in the Northern District of California and served as a federal appellate law clerk to Judge George C. Edwards of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 6th Circuit. She also worked in the Office of Alaska Public Defender in Anchorage and for Judge Vincent C. Broderick, U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York. She is a member of the Santa Clara County Coalition Against the Death Penalty. At present, she is a regional co-chair for the Women for Obama Finance Council and co-chair for Lawyers for Obama. She is a graduate of Harvard College and Northeastern University School of Law. Elspeth, thank you. I should point out that just very recently there was an article that came out in the New York Times about, I think maybe about a week ago, on the 15th, an article about her great-grandfather who went to the electric chair in Sing Sing. He died an agonizing death. 9 minutes, it took 9 minutes to kill him. It was a botched execution, and he is now widely considered to have been innocent. Okay, Christine Thomas is a social justice activist working for sentencing reform in California, including ending capital punishment and LWOP, or life without parole. Her husband, Correll Thomas, is housed on San Quentin's condemned row. Christine has spent over 2 decades working in defense of indigent defendants. She began her career as an advocate at the Milwaukee County State Public Defender's Office in the mid-1980s at the trial level. In 1996, she joined the Federal Defender's Office of the Eastern District of California as a paralegal on non-capital habeas and appeals. 12 years ago, she was promoted to the Capital Habeas Unit, where she works on behalf of death row prisoners in California. She was appointed to the California Platform Committee by John Burton, and in 2012 led the successful effort to add the plank that supports replacing the death penalty with a term of permanent incarceration. Christine is an active member of the campaign to end the death penalty and does not support life without parole as a solution to lethal injection. Christine, are you here? There's Christine Thomas. Our last panelist is Barbara Becknell, who's an activist, author, and nonprofit executive. She worked for 13 years with Nobel Peace Prize nominee and death row prisoner Stanley Tookie Williams, who was tortured to death by the state of California in 2005. Ms. Becknell, and by the way, I'm reading the introductions as the speakers have wanted me to introduce them, so I wanted to point that out. Ms. Becknell and Mr. Williams co-authored 9 award-winning violence prevention books for children that are still being used in schools throughout the world. Ms. Becknell also co-produced a TV movie, Redemption, that starred Jamie Foxx as Mr. Williams and Lynn Whitfield as Ms. Becknell. The project won 2 NAACP Image Awards and was nominated for 2 Golden Globe as well as Independent Spirit and Screen Actors Guilds Awards. Ms. Becknell recently played a leadership role in organizing a new division of the Bay Area Occupy movement called Occupy for Prisoners, which launched the National Occupy Day in support of prisoners in February of this year that included an Occupy San Quentin rally where over 800 people protested the poor conditions of prisoners. Ms. Becknell served as co-MC of that event. Last year, she debated at Oxford University against the reestablishment of the death penalty in the United Kingdom, and she won the debate. She is currently the president of the Black Heritage Foundation, where she will be leading a national voter education campaign to increase voter participation of people of color. The campaign is called Vote or Pick Cotton. Ms. Becknell attended Adelphi University, Harvard, and MIT, where she studied quantitative economics in a PhD program. She also won a postgraduate school fellowship to study philosophy at the University of Chicago. Please welcome Ms. Becknell. Okay. So now how this is going to work is starting with Natasha and working all the way up. We'll have 2-minute statements, and then if the speakers could have a seat at the table, we'll begin with an opening question by Mike Thaler, and then we'll start the conversation from there. Okay? All right, Natasha? And I'm going to get my stuff out of here.
Thank you very much, especially to Karen. Thank you very much for organizing this discussion. We're really eager to have an open conversation here. My name is Natasha Minsker. I am the campaign manager for Prop 34. Prop 34, the initiative that will end the death penalty in California, is the culmination of many years of work. Because the death penalty was enacted by the voters, it must be repealed by the voters. And that takes a very careful strategy, and many years have gone into developing this strategy. It is also part of a coordinated nationwide strategy to end the death penalty across the entire country. Factors have aligned to make November 2012 the best chance we have ever had to actually end the death penalty in the state of California. Some of those factors are completely unique to this year, and that is why we must succeed in 2012. We must succeed because if we fail, executions will return to the state of California. Executions have been on hold for 6 years because of the lethal injection challenge. Already, the Department of Corrections is moving in the direction to switch to a one-drug protocol. When they make that switch, it will take about 18 months for the regulations to be approved and for all of the court challenges to be dismissed, and executions will come back to California. You may have forgotten, but those of us who have been through them have not. It was not that long ago that California was actually poised to carry out 3 executions in a row. If we had been carrying out executions in this past 6 years, 14 people would have been killed by the state of California. We must win. We must win because this initiative is also about ending the death penalty across the entire country. We cannot pass repeal legislation in places like Georgia, and Alabama, and Texas. We must end the death penalty in California and other states so that we can establish that the rest of the country has moved away from the death penalty, and we will reach a point where the United States Supreme Court will have to say to states like Texas and Georgia, enough. California is critical to the national campaign to end the death penalty, and if you want to stop executions in California, if you want to stop executions in Georgia, then we urge you to support Prop 34. Thank you.
Our next speaker, James, would you like to come up? Sorry about that.
That's ridiculous. I'll be right back. What's going on?
Thank you all. My name is James. I'm the Southern California Regional Coordinator for the Yes on 34 campaign. And I just want to briefly explain what Prop 34 does and what it does not do. So Prop 34 replaces the death penalty with life in prison without the possibility of parole. The first thing that does is ensures that California will never execute an innocent person. As long as we have the death penalty, we are at risk of executing innocent people. The second thing that Prop 34 does is save the state, according to the Legislative Analyst's Office, $130 million every single year. So that means the death penalty costs $130 million over and above the cost of life without the possibility of parole. So that in addition to, we save $130 million over every single year. We eliminate any special housing reserved for death row inmates and eliminate the penalty phase of the trial process. So when a person is convicted of murder, if it's a death eligible crime, currently there's an entire second trial that determines whether the penalty will be life or death. That is entirely eliminated if we vote yes on Prop 34. And finally, the last thing that Prop 34 does is put a portion of those savings into a special fund called the Safe California Fund. This is intended to solve more violent crimes throughout the state. Its money is $100 million over the course of 3 years for things like DNA tests, rape kit analysis, fingerprint analysis. I don't know if you all heard, I just learned a couple days ago that the LAPD has now rationed fingerprint analysis. And they have admitted that some cases will never receive the fingerprint analysis they need. So this special fund is under the control of the Attorney General Kamala Harris and will be dispersed to local law enforcement for those things like fingerprint analysis. Finally, what Prop 34 does not do is expand life without parole in any way. It does not make any more crimes eligible for life without parole, and it does not make life without parole more difficult to change or to replace in the future. Life without parole is currently enacted by the voters. The only way to alter it is with another act by the voters. Prop 34 does not change that in any way. Thank you.
Christine Thomas.
First, I'd like to say thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. I want to introduce something into this conversation that from the moment I went down to the Attorney General's office and heard Jeannie Woodford and Gil Garcetti announce this campaign, I felt like an elephant was stepping on my chest because I heard no prisoner voices. And you might think because my husband is on death row that that's why I'm talking. But I want to tell you just a minute about my life story. I was a juvenile in the system. When I was 11 years old, I was locked in a cell. I went on to become a teenager that was in trouble, and somebody helped me. I made the jump. But then I went and worked in a mental health center in the late 70s and the early 80s. People helped me, but every time I did public defender work from trial to habeas to death row, I see my people. So the reason I'm here tonight is because I want you to hear prisoner voices. Now, Correll Thomas is going to be on recording. Jarvis Masters, some of you have read his books. Oprah has lauded his story. He's the Buddhist of death row. And Ken Hartman, who runs the other death penalty project that has done 33 years of a life sentence, will be calling in to talk to us tonight from Lancaster, California State Prison, Lancaster. I think that this campaign, that runs a campaign talking about lauding the sentence of Elwha, talks about locking up people, throwing away the key, bashing on people. You need to hear about the other death sentence, that these people will die in a cell, and what this means. That's why I'm here tonight. Thank you.
Okay, please take a seat. Next, we have Elspeth Farmer. Elspeth, remember, keep it brief, guys.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. I'm the current chair of the platform of the Criminal Justice Plan of the Platform Committee, and I was there in 2010 when finally the California Democratic Party put in the platform that we support replacing the death penalty with a term of permanent incarceration. And I want to just point out to you that permanent incarceration is a broad term that includes life with the possibility of parole. So although Prop 34, the language tracks the what's in our platform, it's narrower because LWOP is a life imprisonment with no hope of rehabilitation and no hope of redemption. You have no once you're there, it's the throw away the key sentence, while permanent incarceration includes sentencing people just to plain life. The other thing I want to make clear, and I think Natasha might mention this later on in the discussion if people have questions, is what safe passes, what will happen to the 725 prisoners on death row. There are 328 prisoners now who have no attorney. And those people will, when once safe passes, their sentence will automatically they'll be sort of resentenced on the day the act is passed, if it passes, and they will go into LWOP status. And with LWOP status, they have a right to habeas, but they don't have a right to a state-appointed attorney. So this raises the question of what happens to people who are sentenced in this way, who, although they have on paper, the right to certain legal claims, there's no one to represent them, and there's no state-appointed attorney, and we don't have enough attorneys in California right now to even represent the people who the state is willing to pay. And I'll wrap.
Our next speaker is Barbara Becknow, and take it away, Barbara. And I think
so thank you, Karen, for inviting me here this evening to share my opinion and my view of Prop 34. So I guess I want to begin with saying that I think this discussion about Prop 34 needs to be reframed. And it needs to be reframed, I believe, based on some things that I've learned and experienced, particularly during the time 6.5 years ago, when I was involved in the fight to try to save the life of Stanley Tookie Williams. And during that time, I was visiting him the last 30 days of his life. The rules changed, and he's allowed to get visitors every day. And when I would visit, I would be pulled to the side in the visiting room by prisoners who themselves had been sentenced with LWOP. Yes, okay, oh, 1 minute, all right. And they would pull me aside and say, tell Tookie we support him, tell Tookie, you know, we're praying for him, but we're just like them. And my thing would be, what do you mean? And they would say, the only way we leave San Quentin is in a casket, just like Tookie and just like the other people on death row. He said, so they would say, we're dead men walking too. So with that information, with that experience, what I can say in closing is that this discussion needs to be reframed. Prop 34 is, in fact, an anti-lethal injection measure. It is not an anti-death penalty measure. So I cannot support it because it supports the death penalty, because it supports LWOP. Thank you.
So with that underway, as you can see, there is a set of varying opinions here. So what we're going to do in the next few minutes is allow the speakers themselves to kind of have a free-flowing conversation, and then at which point, after a while, we will kind of stop so that we can have some audience participation. So that's how that's going to go, and we literally have about, well, 2 minutes shy of an hour right now. So we're going to be watching the time on that, okay? So,
Karen, could I ask that we have the clip of David Dow to start out so people can actually have a clue of the kind of people that are sent to death row. He does a TED Talk, and talks about the type of people that are sent to death row.
2 weeks ago, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, Katya, and we were talking about what I was going to talk about today. We have an 11-year-old son. His name is Lincoln. He was sitting at the same table doing his math homework. And during a pause in my conversation with Katya, I looked over at Lincoln, and I was suddenly thunderstruck by a recollection of a client of mine. My client was a guy named Will. He was from North Texas. He never knew his father very well because his father left his mom while she was pregnant with him. And so he was destined to be raised by a single mom, which might have been all right, except that this particular single mom was a paranoid schizophrenic. And when Will was 5 years old, she tried to kill him with a butcher knife. She was taken away by authorities and placed in a psychiatric hospital. And so for the next several years, Will lived with his older brother until he committed suicide by shooting himself through the heart. And after that, Will bounced around from one family member to another until by the time he was 9 years old, he was essentially living on his own. That morning that I was sitting with Katya and Lincoln, I looked at my son and I realized that when my client Will was his age, he'd been living by himself for 2 years. Will eventually joined a gang and committed a number of very serious crimes, including, most seriously of all, a horrible, tragic murder. And Will was ultimately executed as punishment for that crime. But I don't want to talk today about the morality of capital punishment. I certainly think that my client shouldn't have been executed, but what I would like to do today instead is talk about the death penalty in a way I've never done before, in a way that is entirely non-controversial. I think that's possible because there is a corner of the death penalty debate, maybe the most important corner, where everybody agrees, where the most ardent death penalty supporters and the most vociferous abolitionists are on exactly the same page. That's the corner I want to explore. Before I do that, though, I want to spend a couple of minutes telling you how a death penalty case unfolds, and then I want to tell you 2 lessons that I have learned over the last 20 years as a death penalty lawyer from watching well more than 100 cases unfold in this way. You can think of a death penalty case as a story that has 4 chapters. The first chapter of every case is exactly the same, and it is tragic. It begins with the murder of an innocent human being, and it's followed by a trial where the murderer is convicted and sent to death row, and that death sentence is ultimately upheld by the state appellate court. The second chapter consists of a complicated legal proceeding known as a state habeas corpus appeal. The third chapter is an even more complicated legal proceeding known as a federal habeas corpus proceeding. And the fourth chapter is one where a variety of things can happen. The lawyers might file a clemency petition, they might initiate even more complex litigation, or they might not do anything at all, but that fourth chapter always ends with an execution. When I started representing death row inmates more than 20 years ago, people on death row did not have a right to a lawyer in either the second or the fourth chapter of this story. They were on their own. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1980s that they acquired a right to a lawyer during the third chapter of the story. So what all of these death row inmates had to do was rely on volunteer lawyers to handle their legal proceedings. The problem is that there were way more guys on death row than there were lawyers who had both the interest and the expertise to work on these cases. And so inevitably, lawyers drifted to cases that were already in Chapter 4. That makes sense, of course. Those are the cases that are most urgent. Those are the guys who are closest to being executed. Some of these lawyers were successful. They managed to get new trials for their clients. Others of them managed to extend the lives of their clients, sometimes by years, sometimes by months. But the one thing that didn't happen was that there was never a serious and sustained decline in the number of annual executions in Texas. In fact, as you can see from this graph, from the time that the Texas execution apparatus got efficient in the mid to late 1990s, there have only been a couple of years where the number of annual executions dipped below 20. In a typical year in Texas, we're averaging about 2 people a month. In some years in Texas, we've executed close to 40 people, and this number has never significantly declined over the last 15 years. And yet, at the same time that we continue to execute about the same number of people every year, the number of people who we're sentencing to death on an annual basis has dropped rather steeply. So we have this paradox, which is that the number of annual executions has remained high, but the number of new death sentences has gone down. Why is that? It can't be attributed to a decline in the murder rate, because the murder rate has not declined nearly so steeply as the red line on that graph has gone down. What has happened instead is that juries have started to sentence more and more people to prison for the rest of their lives without the possibility of parole, rather than sending them to the execution chamber. Why has that happened? It hasn't happened because of a dissolution of popular support for the death penalty. Death penalty opponents take great solace in the fact that death penalty support in Texas is at an all-time low. Do you know what all-time low in Texas means? It means that it's in the low 60%. Now that's really good compared to the mid-1980s when it was in excess of 80%. But we can't explain the decline in death sentences and the affinity for life without the possibility of parole by an erosion of support for the death penalty, because people still support the death penalty. What's happened to cause this phenomenon? What's happened is that lawyers who represent death row inmates have shifted their focus to earlier and earlier chapters of the death penalty story. So 25 years ago, they focused on Chapter 4, and they went from Chapter 4 25 years ago to Chapter 3 in the late 1980s. And they went from Chapter 3 in the late 1980s to Chapter 2 in the mid-1990s. And beginning in the mid to late 1990s, they began to focus on Chapter 1 of the story. Now, you might think that this decline in death sentences and the increase in the number of life sentences is a good thing or a bad thing. I don't want to have a conversation about that today. All that I want to tell you is that the reason that this has happened is because death penalty lawyers have understood that the earlier you intervene in a case, the greater the likelihood that you're going to save your client's life. That's the first thing I've learned. Here's the second thing I learned. My client Will was not the exception to the rule. He was the rule. I sometimes say, if you tell me the name of a death row inmate, doesn't matter what state he's in, doesn't matter if I've ever met him before, I'll write his biography for you. And 8 out of 10 times, the details of that biography will be more or less accurate. And the reason for that is that 80% of the people on death row are people who came from the same sort of dysfunctional family that Will did. 80% of the people on death row are people who had exposure to the juvenile justice system. That's the second lesson that I've learned. Now we're right on the cusp of that corner where everybody's going to agree. People in this room might disagree about whether Will should have been executed, but I think everybody would agree that the best possible version of his story would be a story where no murder ever occurs. How do we do that? When our son Lincoln was working on that math problem 2 weeks ago, it was a big, gnarly problem. And he was learning how when you have a big old gnarly problem, sometimes the solution is to slice it into smaller problems. That's what we do for most problems. In math and physics, even in social policy, we slice them into smaller, more manageable problems. But every once in a while, as Dwight Eisenhower said, the way you solve a problem is to make it bigger. Okay. The way we solve this problem is to make the issue of the death penalty bigger. We have to say, all right, we have these 4 chapters of a death penalty story, but what happens before that story begins? How can we intervene in the life of a murderer before he's a murderer? What options do we have to nudge that person off of the path that is going to lead to a result that everybody, death penalty supporters and death penalty opponents, still think is a bad result, the murder of an innocent human being? You know, sometimes people say that something isn't rocket science. And by that what they mean is rocket science is really complicated. And this problem that we're talking about now is really simple. Well, that's rocket science. That's the mathematical expression for the thrust created by a rocket. What we're talking about today is just as complicated. What we're talking about today is also rocket science. My client Will, and 80% of the people on death row, had 5 chapters in their lives that came before the 4 chapters of the death penalty story. I think of these 5 chapters as points of intervention, places in their lives when our society could have intervened in their lives and nudged them off of the path that they were on that created a consequence that we all, death penalty supporters or death penalty opponents, say was a bad result. Now, during each of these 5 chapters, when his mother was pregnant with him, in his early childhood years, when he was in elementary school, when he was middle school and then high school, and when he was in the juvenile justice system, during each of those 5 chapters, there were a wide variety of things that society could have done. In fact, if we just imagine that there are 5 different modes of intervention, the way that society could intervene, in each of those 5 chapters, and we could mix and match them any way we want, there are 3,000, more than 3,000 possible strategies that we could embrace in order to nudge kids like Will off of the path that they're on. So I'm not standing here today with the solution. But the fact that we still have a lot to learn, that doesn't mean that we don't know a lot already. We know from experience in other states that there are a wide variety of modes of intervention that we could be using in Texas and in every other state that isn't using them in order to prevent a consequence that we all agree is bad. I'll just mention a few. I won't talk today about reforming the legal system. That's probably a topic that's best reserved for a room full of lawyers and judges. Instead, let me talk about a couple of modes of intervention that we can all help accomplish, because they are modes of intervention that will come about when legislators and policymakers, when taxpayers and citizens agree that that's what we ought to be doing and that's how we ought to be spending our money. We could be providing early childhood care for economically disadvantaged and otherwise troubled kids. And we could be doing it for free. And we could be nudging kids like Will off of the path that we're on. There are other states that do that, but we don't. We could be providing special schools at both the high school level and the middle school level, but even in K through 5, that target economically and otherwise disadvantaged kids, and particularly kids who have had exposure to the juvenile justice system. There are a handful of states that do that. Texas doesn't. There's one other thing we can be doing. Well, there are a bunch of other things we can be doing. There's one other thing that we could be doing that I'm going to mention, and this is going to be the only controversial thing that I say today. We could be intervening much more aggressively into dangerously dysfunctional homes and getting kids out of them before their moms pick up butcher knives and threaten to kill them. If we're going to do that, we need a place to put them. Even if we do all of those things, some kids are going to fall through the cracks and they're going to end up in that last chapter before the murder story begins. They're going to end up in the juvenile justice system. And even if that happens, it's not yet too late. There's still time to nudge them if we think about nudging them rather than just punishing them. There are 2 professors in the Northeast, one at Yale and one at Maryland. They set up a school that is attached to a juvenile prison. And the kids are in prison, but they go to school from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Now, it was logistically difficult. They had to recruit teachers who wanted to teach inside a prison. They had to establish strict separation between the people who work at the school and the prison authorities. And most dauntingly of all, they needed to invent a new curriculum, because you know what? People don't come into and out of prison on a semester basis. But they did all those things. Now, what do all of these things have in common? What all of these things have in common is that they cost money. Some of the people in the room might be old enough to remember the guy on the old oil filter commercial. He used to say, well, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. What we're doing in the death penalty system is we're paying later. But the thing is, that for every $15,000 that we spend intervening in the lives of economically and otherwise disadvantaged kids in those earlier chapters, we save $80,000 in crime-related costs down the road. Even if you don't agree that there's a moral imperative that we do it, it just makes economic sense. I want to tell you about the last conversation that I had with Will. It was the day that he was going to be executed. And we were just talking. There was nothing left to do in his case. And we were talking about his life. And he was talking first about his dad, who he hardly knew, who had died, and then about his mom, who he did know, who was still alive. And I said to him, I know the story. I've read the records. I know that she tried to kill you. I said, but I've always wondered whether you really actually remember that. I said, I don't remember anything from when I was 5 years old. Maybe you just remember somebody telling you. And he looked at me and he leaned forward and he said, Professor, he'd known me for 12 years, he still called me Professor. He said, Professor, I don't mean any disrespect by this, but when your mama picks up a butcher knife that looks bigger than you are and chases you through the house screaming she's going to kill you, and you have to lock yourself in the bathroom and lean against the door and holler for help until the police get there. He looked at me and he said, that's something you don't forget. I hope there's one thing you all won't forget. In between the time you arrived here this morning and the time we break for lunch, there are going to be 4 homicides in the United States. We're going to devote enormous social resources to punishing the people who commit those crimes, and that's appropriate because we should punish people who do bad things. But 3 of those crimes are preventable. If we make the picture bigger and devote our attention to the earlier chapters, then we're never going to write the first sentence that begins the death penalty story. Thank you.